The drawing-room of Ashmore Park had not changed in the 14 months since Cecily Vane had last stood in it, and that sameness felt, on a grey November morning, like an accusation. The same cream-painted walls, the same portrait of the late Earl above the mantel, his painted gaze permanently fixed on the window, the same arrangement of chairs in which Lady Dorothea Fenwick held court, her spine exactly 3 inches from the chairback, her fan, at rest, across her lap. The same dark walnut sideboard with the same pair of silver candlesticks she had polished herself on the 3rd Saturday of every month because the footman who ordinarily managed them had a weakness for neglecting their stems. The only thing that had changed was the company. Where Cecily had once sat as companion and near confidant, she now stood in the doorway, with mud on the hem of her traveling pelisse, a small worn leather satchel in one hand, and to her left, conspicuous and entirely unmistakable, the Reverend Mr. Camber, Edmund Hartley of St. Cuthbert's, Ashmore Village, who had come 4 miles on a cold Tuesday morning because she had written to him and asked him to come. Lady Dorothea looked at Cecily the way one looks at a stray that is returned, not with any warmth, but with the quiet contempt of certainty. "You were told," she said, "not to return to this house." Cecily had rehearsed many answers to that sentence during the long journey from Bath. She chose none of them. She said, "I know what I was told, my lady. I have also brought what you were not permitted to hear." The room held 11 people. She had not expected 11. She had expected 4. Perhaps 5. She saw the Marquess of Fenwick standing at the window, turned half away from the room, exactly as his painted father had taught him to stand. She had not expected him either. She was going to need every word she had. The season that preceded Cecily's expulsion from Ashmore Park had not been, in her estimation, a particularly difficult one. She was 24 years old, and she had been in service as a paid companion to Lady Dorothea Fenwick for 3 years by then, which was long enough to understand the rhythms of that particular household, and short enough that she still noticed the texture of its small cruelties. Lady Dorothea was the widow of an earl, the mother of a marquess, and a woman who had organized her life around the management of consequence. She was not unkind in the obvious ways. She did not shout. She did not demean by name. She demeaned by omission, by the carefully calibrated pause before a sentence, by the habit of recalling previous companions' superior qualities at moments when Cecily had just completed a task without error. Cecily had learned to read those pauses the way a sailor reads water. She had also learned, during those 3 years, the layout of the park's small library and the hours when it was empty. The library had been her compensation. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of bound volumes that Lady Dorothea never touched, a fire that the footman kept well tended, and 3 hours on most mornings before the household required her attendance. She had read everything from Cowper to legal philosophy. She had read over the course of one wet October all 4 volumes of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. She could not have said at the time why that felt important. She had known in the vague way one knows things before they become necessary. That information held quietly is worth more than information displayed. The trouble had begun with the sapphire brooch. It was Lady Dorothea's brooch, a piece of some value, the deep blue stone set in gold, with a small ring of seed pearls around its circumference. It lived, ordinarily, in a flat case on the 2nd shelf of the jewelry cabinet, in her ladyship's dressing room. On the 14th of October, 14 months ago now, it had not been there. The household had been assembled in the drawing room, servants and guests both, which was unusual enough to make Cecily's hands go cold before Lady Dorothea had finished her first sentence. The piece was missing. The case was empty. Someone in the household had taken it. Lady Dorothea's gaze, precise and without hurry, had moved across every face in the room before settling, with the terrible weight of arriving, rather than searching, on Cecily's. She had not taken the brooch. She had known in the moment that gaze landed that saying so would not help her. What she had not known, standing in that drawing room with her hands cold and her pulse audible behind her jaw, was that she could prove it. The proof was simple. She had not yet found it. Lady Dorothea had given her 2 hours to pack. Cecily had asked for the opportunity to speak. She had been told that she might speak when the constable came, if she liked, but that her character reference from this house was already decided. 2 hours. The village road. The coach to Bath, where her mother's cousin kept a narrow house and a moderate charity, she had gone. She had also in the first month in Bath written to 3 people, a solicitor she could not afford, a former housemaid of Ashmore Park, whose cousin was in service elsewhere, and the Reverend Mr. Quentin, Edmund Hartley, who had baptized her and confirmed her, and who still knew, from his records, every date she had ever needed recorded. The Reverend Mr. Hartley had replied within the week. His letter had been 4 lines long. He had said that, yes, he believed she was correct. He had said that he would come whenever she needed him. He had said that the truth is its own warrant, Miss Vane, if it can be read aloud. She had waited 11 months to be sure of her ground, and then she had come. Those 11 months had not been idle. They had been, in their way, the most concentrated and purposeful period of Cecily's life, though no one watching her at her cousin's table would have recognized them as such. She had sat at mealtimes and listened to her cousin's sighs without comment, because the cost of her keep was gratitude, and she owed it. She had attended church on Sundays in a gown she had retrimmed to look respectable and not quite the same gown 3 weeks running. She had walked in the afternoons, because walking cost nothing, and kept the worst hours at bay. In the evenings she had written letters, drafted timelines, and read whatever she could borrow from the circulating library. Building the case she intended to bring back to the drawing room, where the accusation had been made. The solicitor's reply had arrived in November, 3 weeks after her letter to him. He could not afford to take her case, he said, but he could tell her this much. The question was not who was blamed, but when the act was committed, and whether her presence could be established at another location during the relevant hours. She had already suspected as much. What she had needed was the legal form of it, the precise language that would make a parish register into a document rather than merely a record. This was not a choice, born of pride, though Lady Dorothea's drawing-room face suggested she had read it as exactly that. The sapphire brooch had been found 6 weeks after Cecily's departure. It had been discovered in a coat pocket belonging to Mr. Gerald Ashwood, Lady Dorothea's nephew and frequent house-guest, who had taken it on a Tuesday night with every intention of having it reproduced by a jeweler in Tunbridge Wells and returning the original before it was noticed. He had miscalculated the timeline. The discovery had been quiet, as discoveries involving one's own family tend to be, and Mr. Ashwood had been dispatched to his father's estate in Durham with an allowance reduced by half, and a general understanding that the matter was closed. It was not, in any legal or moral sense, closed for Cecily Vane. She had learned of the discovery through the former housemaid's cousin. The cousin had written with the information in January, 7 months after Cecily's departure, adding in a postscript that no one had spoken Miss Vane's name in the household since October, and that Lady Dorothea referred to the incident, when it could not be avoided, as a most unfortunate misunderstanding. A most unfortunate misunderstanding. Cecily had set that letter down on the narrow table in her cousin's house in Bath, and had looked at the wall for a considerable time. She had lost her position, her income, and her character reference. She had spent 3 months unable to find another place, because Lady Dorothea's silence was its own verdict in every drawing-room in Somerset. She had listened to her cousin's sighs at mealtimes without comment, because the cost of her keep was gratitude, and she owed it a most unfortunate misunderstanding. She had returned to Blackstone that afternoon, because it was the only company that had nothing to gain from flattering her. She had also, in the privacy of a gray January afternoon, allowed herself precisely 15 minutes of the kind of anger that has no outlet and no resolution, the clean, cold anger of a woman who has been wronged by people who will never fully understand that they have wronged her. Then she had put it away, because anger that is not directed is only weight, and she had enough weight to carry. The second letter to Mr. Hartley had been written in March, when she had assembled the necessary documentation. Mr. Hartley had, in his careful parish records, a notation. On the 14th of October, the day the brooch was alleged to have gone missing, Cecily Vane had presented herself at St. Cuthbert's at 9:30 in the morning, before the household assembled in the drawing room, before Lady Dorothea's gaze had settled on her. She had come to arrange the flowers for the Sunday service, as she had done on the first and third Saturdays of every month for 2 years. Mr. Hartley had recorded her presence, as he recorded all parish business, in his register. He had signed and dated the entry. The brooch had last been confirmed in its case, on the evening of the 13th, by Lady Dorothea's own lady's maid, a woman named Frith, who kept her own records and who had stated as much to the assembled household on the morning of the 14th, before Cecily arrived back from the church. It had gone missing in the night during the hours when Gerald Ashwood had walked the house unchallenged. Cecily had not been present. She had been at St. Cuthbert's. There was a signed register that said so. The satchel in her left hand contained a copy of that register entry certified by Mr. Hartley's own hand. It contained Frith's written statement, which had cost her a difficult letter and 3 weeks of waiting, and which Frith had supplied because, as she had written, she had her own conscience to consider, and because she had always known it was Mr. Gryn. Gerald. It contained a letter from the solicitor she could not afford, who had nonetheless agreed to put 1 page of legal language in exchange for her promise of eventual payment, language that laid out the precise timeline and named the parties clearly. She had not brought these things to threaten anyone. She had brought them because they were the truth. And the truth, Mr. Hartley had said, was its own warrant, if it could be read aloud. She intended to read it aloud. She had known, or suspected, that the Marquess of Fenwick might be present. He came to the park in November as a rule, to review the estate accounts with his steward, and to spend a fortnight with his mother before the social calendar reclaimed him. He was 31 years old, recently come into his title, and she had formed, during 3 years in his mother's household, a careful and disciplined opinion of him. He was not easy to read. That was the plain fact of him. He was not warm exactly, but she had seen him be generous without announcement, and patient without effort in contexts that would have strained a lesser man's composure. He had spoken to Cecily perhaps 20 times in 3 years. Always in passing, always correctly. She had watched him, at dinner, quietly redirect a conversation that had grown unkind. She had watched him, in the library one afternoon, finish a passage of Cowper before he put the book down and left, as though he owed the poem his full attention before the world could claim him back. She had thought about him, during the 11 months in Bath, more than was strictly useful. She had thought about the quality of his attention, specifically, how it arrived without artifice or preparation, how it did not adjust itself to the status of its subject. She had observed from the particular vantage of 3 years in a household where rank determined nearly every social calculation, that he applied the same quality of attention to a groom's question about a horse as he applied to a senior peer's argument about land enclosure. She was not, however, here for him. She was here for herself. Lady Dorothea said, "The matter was resolved. There is nothing in this house that pertains to you, Miss Vane. The matter was resolved for the household," Cecily said. Her voice was level. She had practiced that, too. "It was not resolved for me. I was put from this house on the 14th of October 14 months ago without a character, on an accusation that the household's own records now contradict. I have come to say so in the presence of a witness, and to leave copies of the relevant documents, so that the record may be corrected." Someone in the room made a small sound. She did not look to see who. She was watching Lady Dorothea, who had gone very still in the particular way of a woman calculating the cost of several responses at once. "You would do well," Lady Dorothea said, after a pause that lasted 3 full seconds by Cecily's count, "to consider the position you are placing yourself in." "I have considered it for 11 months, Cecily said. "I should like, if I may, to read a brief account of the timeline, with Mr. Hartley as my witness to its accuracy, and then I will leave. I am not here to cause damage. I am here because an accusation was made against me, in this room, in front of this household, and it was false, and I am owed that correction in the same room, in front of some portion of the same household. If she had hoped for immediate acquiescence, she would have been disappointed. Lady Dorothea did not acquiesce. She turned instead to look at the window, where her son had been standing with his back, 3/4 to the room, for the duration of this exchange. The Marquis of Fenwick turned then, fully. He looked at Cecily, and the quality of that attention was not what she had expected. She had expected cool assessment. She had expected, perhaps, the particular blankness of a man who considers a domestic dispute to be beneath his direct engagement. She had expected to feel, under his gaze, the weight of her own social smallness in a room that had once employed her, and now regarded her as an intrusion. She felt none of those things. What she felt was that he was listening, not to the spectacle of her arrival. To her he said nothing. He simply held her gaze for a moment steady and without deflection, and then he moved from the window and sat down in the chair to his mother's left. Not to manage the situation, she thought. To watch it. If you have ever waited for something to be acknowledged, that should long since have been spoken, you know exactly what Cecily felt as she opened her satchel and took out the first document. If that feeling is familiar to you, stay with her for a moment. She has not finished. Lady Dorothea had assembled reasons to object. She produced them in sequence, with the polish of a woman accustomed to having her objections treated as conclusions. The first was that Cecily's character remained the same, regardless of any new information, because her return here, uninvited and accompanied by a clergyman like a deputation, demonstrated precisely the impertinence that had made her an unsuitable companion in the first instance. The second was that she had no standing to make demands of this household, as she had been a paid employee and had been compensated through the end of October, and the termination of her employment, whatever its occasion, was within Lady Dorothea's full legal and social authority. The third was delivered in a quieter register, as though she were speaking to someone else in the room, rather than to Cecily, to the room as a whole, perhaps, to the witnesses she had not anticipated, and was now addressing. A woman who arrives at a gentleman's house with documents and a vicar in tow is not a woman who wishes to set the record straight. She is a woman who wishes to make a scene, and a scene will not restore her position. Cecily did not flinch. She said, "I have no position to restore, my lady. I have only a name. I am asking you to stop telling people it belongs to a thief." The room went very quiet with those words. She had not planned to say them quite so plainly. She was not sorry. It was the Reverend Mr. Hartley who said, with the gentle precision of a man who had been waiting patiently to be useful, "Perhaps I might simply read the entry from the parish register. It is 4 lines. He read them. The date, the time, her name, his signature. The room was very quiet. Frith, who had not been among the 11 people Cecily expected, was standing near the back, beside a younger housemaid, and when Cecily looked at her, Frith's expression did something complicated, a movement across the jaw and eyes that might have been shame, or might have been relief, or might have been both of those things arriving together after a long wait. Lady Dorothea said nothing for a long enough time that the silence acquired its own weight. Then she said in a tone that was not an apology, and was not quite not an apology, "I am aware that Mr. Ashwood was responsible." "Yes," Cecily said. "I know that you know. The matter of your departure was, as I said, an unfortunate misunderstanding." "The matter of my departure," Cecily said carefully, "was an accusation made in error. I am asking that you say so here, to the people in this room who were present when the accusation was made. I am not asking for more than that." Lady Dorothea's fan opened, moved twice, closed. It was the first time Cecily had seen her fidget. The Marquis of Fenwick said, from his chair, quietly and without inflection, "Mother, 1 word. A single addressed syllable." It landed in the room like a stone into water, and the ripples were visible in Lady Dorothea's posture as she adjusted, infinitesimally toward the vertical. She said, "You were not responsible for the brooch's disappearance, Miss Vane. The accusation was made in error. The household was mistaken. It was not a full apology." Cecily had not come for a full apology, because she had understood long before she arrived that full apologies from women of Lady Dorothea's constitution arrive like parliamentary reform, slowly and incompletely, and only under sustained pressure. What she had come for was the spoken correction, in the same room, witnessed. She had it. She looked at Frith. Frith looked at the floor. Then Frith looked up and said, "I never believed it was you, Miss Vane." "I should have said so sooner." Cecily nodded. It was a small acknowledgement, but it was the one she could give honestly, and honesty had brought her this far. She folded the register copy and placed it on the small table by the door. She placed Frith's statement beside it. She placed the solicitor's single page on top of both. "These are yours to keep," she said to the room. "I have retained copies." She picked up her satchel. Mr. Plained. Hartley retrieved his hat from where the footman had taken it at the door, and now stood, ready, a compact and dignified figure, entirely comfortable with having made a 4-mile journey for 4 lines of truth. She was nearly at the door when the Marquess of Fenwick said, "Miss Vane." She turned. He had risen from his chair. He was standing in the middle of the room, which was notable because a man of his rank and economy of movement generally did not stand in the middle of rooms without purpose. He said, "I owe you an apology, as well." She waited. "I was in this house when my mother dismissed you. I was told there was some domestic matter being settled. I did not ask for particulars. I should have." Cecily looked at him for a moment. He had gray eyes, and they were at present entirely focused on her, with an honesty that she found harder to receive than the correction she had come for. She had prepared herself, during 11 months, for several varieties of reception in this room. She had not prepared herself for this. She said, "You were not made aware of the specifics." "No. That is not a sufficient answer, though." He looked at her with the steady quality she had noticed at the window. That particular attention that was neither social calculation nor performance. The specifics were mine to seek. I did not seek them. That was a failure, and it was mine. She was going to say something equitable and contained, something that would allow them both to leave the moment with decorum. She was going to say that she accepted his words in the spirit offered, or something equivalent, a phrase from the middle distance of social courtesy. She did not say that. She said, "You were the only person in this house, in 3 years, who ever returned a book to the library shelf in the right order." She was not certain why she said it. It was true, which was the only justification she had. Something changed in his expression then. Something small and swift at the corners of his mouth, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it, something she had never seen there in 3 years of careful observation. He said, "You noticed. I spent 3 years in that library," she said. "I noticed most things about it." Lady Dorothea was watching this exchange with the focused attention of a woman cataloging information for later consideration. Mr. Spenning. Hartley was studying the door with cheerful diplomatic disengagement. Frith was watching Cecily, with an expression that had migrated from shame toward something warmer. Cecily picked up the strap of her satchel. She was not going to overstay a moment that had already given her more than she had planned for. She said to the room, to no one person in particular, "Thank you for hearing me." She walked to the door. Mr. Hartley followed. The footman opened it. The cold air of the November corridor came in like a clean breath. She was in the hallway, her boot on the first step of the front stairs, when the Marquess of Fenwick came through the drawing-room door behind her. He said simply, "Wait." She turned. He was carrying his coat, which he had retrieved from somewhere with a speed suggesting he had moved, with intention and without hesitation. He said, "Your carriage! You came from the village?" "We walked," Mr. Hartley said pleasantly. 4 miles. The morning was cold." The vicar agreed with the serenity of a man who has made his peace with weather. The Marquis looked at Cecily. He said, "You will take my carriage back. Both of you." A pause. And then, in the register she had always read as protection, though she had never before been the subject of it. "I will hear no argument on the matter," Mr. Hartley said. "Most generous, my lord," and did not look at Cecily, which was either tactful or complicit. She could not determine which. She said, "That is unnecessary, my lord." "I know it is unnecessary," he said. I am offering it regardless." She looked at him. He looked at her. The hallway was cold, and the footman was holding the front door slightly ajar, letting in a thin stripe of November light. And she became aware with the particular acuity that arrives in moments of consequence, of the smell of wood smoke from the drawing-room fire, and the sound of someone moving a piece of furniture somewhere above them, and the fact that her pulse had been elevated since the moment he crossed the room. She said, "Thank you." The carriage was brought. It was the good carriage, not the working one, and the cushions were blue, and the crest on the door was the Fenwick crest, and riding in it through the village of Ashmore at midday would be a communication of the clearest possible kind to anyone who happened to look out a window. She thought he probably knew that. She thought, given the deliberate quality of his attention, that he rarely did anything without knowing exactly what it communicated. Hartley settled into the opposite corner of the carriage and closed his eyes in the manner of a man entirely satisfied with his morning's work. She watched the park's gates pass the window. She watched the lane narrow into the village road. She thought about the library, and the Cowper poem, and the books in correct order, and the way he had said, simply, that it was a failure, and it was his, without decorating it or diminishing it, just stating the fact and letting it stand. The letter arrived at her cousin's house in Bath 6 days later. It was addressed to Miss Cecily Vane in a hand she did not recognize but would not have difficulty attributing. The hand was even and unhurried, the kind of penmanship taught by a man who had learned it once and saw no reason to alter it afterward. The letter said 6 things. It said that he had made further inquiries after her departure and had determined the full shape of what had been done to her, not only by his mother's household, but by the manner in which the unspoken accusation had followed her to Bath, and closed several doors she ought not to have found closed. It said that the solicitor, who had written her 1 page of legal language, had received, the morning after her visit, a payment of the full sum she had promised him, from an account he did not need to identify. It said that he had spoken to 2 households of his acquaintance, the Linthorpe family and the Ravenscroft family, both of whom had declined her application in January and had corrected the understanding under which those declines had been made. It said that he was aware she had not asked for any of this. It said that the library at Ashmore Park had been, in his own estimation, a place of more genuine thought than any other room in the house, and that he had not found, in 3 years of visiting it, anyone else who shelved the volumes in the correct order either. The 6th thing the letter said was a question. He asked whether, if she was willing, she would permit him to call on her cousin's house in Bath the following Thursday, not on any household business, not in any professional capacity, but because he found he had several more things he wished to say to her, and he was discovering that letters were an insufficient medium for them. He signed it with his title, and then, below that, in slightly smaller letters, his given name, which was Thomas. Cecily read the letter twice. She read it a 3rd time, in the narrow sitting room of her cousin's house, with the fire small, and the afternoon light coming gray through the window. She read the line about the library. She read the question. She read the name in smaller letters below the title. She sat very still for a moment. She was aware of the fire, and of the sound of the street outside the window, a carriage somewhere, and then a vendor's call, and then quiet again. She was aware of the satchel on the table, still where she had placed it, on her return from Ashmore, not yet put away. She wrote back that Thursday would suit her very well. He came on Thursday in a plain carriage, not the crested one, which she noted and understood. He came without a secretary, and without announcement. He knocked at the door of her cousin's house, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a man who had decided to do something, and saw no reason to hedge it, and when her cousin's maid showed him into the small sitting room where Cecily waited, he looked at her the same way he had looked at her across the drawing-room at Ashmore Park. With that particular attention that arrived whole and without calculation, they talked for 2 hours. Not about the events at the park. Not initially. About Blackstone and whether his 4th volume was as necessary as his 1st. About Cowper and which of the poems in the collection was most under-read. About the particular quality of morning light in a library, when the fire has been well tended and the household has not yet required anything of you. Her cousin's maid brought in tea, and then biscuits, and then a second pot of tea, and by the end of the second pot, Cecily had said several things she had not planned to say and had not regretted saying them. She had said that she had spent a portion of the 11 months in Bath reading legal philosophy, not because she wished to become a solicitor, but because she wished to understand the architecture of the thing that had been used against her. He had listened to that without the slight adjustment of expression, the subtle indication of surprise at the wrong person, expressing an unexpected interest that she had come to expect in such contexts. He had simply said that Blackstone was a reasonable place to begin, and that if she had not read the works of Lord Mansfield on common law, she might find them useful. She had said honestly that she had not, and he had made a note in a small pocketbook that struck her more than anything else said during the 2 hours. He did not explain the note. He simply made it, tucked the book away, and returned to the conversation, as though writing down a thing that might be useful was too obvious to require remark. He said, before he left, that he would like to come again the following week, if she was willing. He said it as a question rather than an arrangement, which was different from the way he had spoken about the carriage. She told him she was willing. He came the following week, and the week after that. In December he walked with her along the cold Bath streets to a bookseller she had frequented since her arrival, and he bought 2 volumes of Cowper that he said the library at Ashmore lacked, and then stood in the street, the cold air, reading the first page of the first volume with the same unhurried attention she had observed across 3 years and 1 drawing-room confrontation and a 6-point letter. She watched him in the cold and thought about the 11 months in Bath and the letter she had written and the careful work of assembling what was hers to carry back. She thought about all of it arriving, eventually, in this particular form. A gray Bath street, a cold December morning, a man reading Cowper on a pavement with complete indifference to the temperature. In January, in the Bath Assembly Rooms, she met Lady Linthorpe and Mrs. Ravenscroft, both of whom expressed what appeared to be genuine warmth upon her introduction, the kind of warmth that arrives after a correction has been quietly made by someone with the social authority to make it land. Lady Dorothea sent a note in February. It was 3 sentences. It expressed that she hoped Miss Vane was in good health. It expressed that the matter of the previous autumn had been regrettable. It enclosed, folded inside the note, a character reference, written in full, dated from the conclusion of her 3 years in service, citing her industry and her discretion and her good judgment without qualification. Cecily read the note at the small desk in her cousin's house. She folded it and placed it in the leather satchel. The character reference she put separately, because she would need to have it copied for practical use. Then she sat for a moment and considered what it meant to be the recipient of a thing that should have been given freely and freely withheld for 15 months. She did not feel triumph. She felt, more than anything, the specific tired relief of a long effort finally released. The way a hand unclenches, slowly, when it has been gripped for so long the opening hurts. She also thought, not for the first time that week, of the question he had asked in March, on a Tuesday morning in the small sitting room where they had first spoken for 2 hours. He had not approached it circuitously. He had said that he had come to a considered conclusion, and that his nature preferred to state such things plainly rather than to arrange them as a performance, and so he would state it plainly. He wished, if she was willing, to pursue a formal understanding between them, with the intention, if they continued to suit each other as well as they had suited each other for the previous 4 months, of making it a permanent one. She had asked, because she was who she was, what he meant by suit. He had thought about it for a moment. With the careful deliberation she had come to understand was not hesitation, but the real effort to say the accurate thing. He had said that she was honest without requiring that everyone around her be instructed in it. She was careful about evidence, but not cold. She read well, and thought about what she read. She had walked 4 miles on a cold November morning with a vicar and a leather satchel, and had stood in a room where she was not wanted, and had spoken the truth without decoration. And he had watched her do it, and had thought not in the moment, but afterward, with the clarity that arrives after a room empties and a performance is over, that he had not met another person in his acquaintance who would have done it with that degree of both precision and restraint. He had also said, after a pause, that he was aware she might have several reasonable objections, and that he was prepared to hear them. She had one. She said that she was not a woman of rank or fortune, and that while she did not believe this should be relevant, she understood it would be regarded as such by a portion of his world, and she wished him to have considered that fully before he stated a conclusion. He had said that he had considered it. He had also said that he had observed over the previous 31 years no correlation between rank and the qualities he was now describing. She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and the fire in the grate of the small sitting room made its small sounds. And neither of them moved for a moment. She had said, yes. The spring came late to Bath, and when it arrived all at once, the kind of sudden warmth that follows a long gray winter and makes the streets feel different underfoot. Mr. Stas. Hartley came from Ashmore for the formal occasion as she had written and asked him, and he performed the ceremony in the small chapel her cousin's family attended, with a congregation of 23 people and no diamonds to speak of, and an arrangement of white narcissus on the altar that she had selected because they were the first flowers she had learned to arrange at St. Cuthbert's, the same flowers she had been tending on the 14th of October, when a woman 14 miles away had opened a jewelry case and found it empty. The register entry in Mr. Prady. Hartley's hand at the close of the ceremony was 8 lines long rather than 4. He had been recording things carefully, as he always did, for the moment when truth required its warrant and someone needed to read it aloud. That evening, in the drawing-room of the house in Camden Place that served as their lodging before the journey north to Fenwick, she sat with Thomas and the fire and the 2 volumes of Cowper he had bought in December. She was reading. He was reading. The room was warm and the street outside the window was quiet, only the sound of a carriage at some distance. And then nothing again. She had the leather satchel on the small table beside her chair. She had not yet put it away. She thought she might keep it where she could see it for a little while longer, not because it contained anything she still needed, but because it had carried what she needed when she carried it herself, and there was a kind of respect one owed a thing that had served its purpose faithfully. She thought of the 4 miles in the cold, the 11 months in the narrow house, the parish register, 4 lines, precise and plain and sufficient. He looked up from his page. He looked at her. He said nothing. She looked back. Said nothing. It was the same quality of attention he had brought to a poem 14 miles away on an October afternoon 3 years ago, before any of this had been possible. The attention of a man who believed a thing was worth his full presence before the world could claim him back. She picked up her page. He picked up his. Outside the window, the first light rain of spring began to fall. Soft on the sets, quiet on the glass, and neither of them remarked upon it, because it required no remark at all.